Hello, Dr. Kimble Greene. How are you today?
I'm well, Rico. How are you?
I'm doing really good. It's a great Monday. That's good.
Yeah, that's good.
Yes, but no, thank you for joining us today on the Mental Health Half Hour. I'm very excited to have you on and talk about a very important topic of empathetic leadership. But before we get there, would you mind just sharing with us your location and letting us know a little bit about yourself and your journey to evolutionary leadership?
Oh, well, it's been quite a journey, I think, as for most of us.
Yes.
Um, I am coming to you today from Maine, the beautiful state of Maine, USA, and loving the wildlife and the natural aspects. Not to mention, I think Maine is probably has one of the lowest cases of COVID right now. So it's kind of a blessing to be here.
You put
But
it on
as
the list because my husband and I have not been, and we were just
oh,
talking yesterday, and we're like, we have to go to Maine. Now
you
we
do.
have to go to Maine.
You do, yes. And I will be glad to host you when you get here.
Perfect. Love it.
So my story, I was thinking recently about else had asked me about my story, and I was thinking about how we use our stories to either stay stuck or propel ourselves forward. And one of the aha moments I had was that if we let go of judgment about our stories and our lives, whether they're good or bad, let go of all judgment, and are able to see them as all of the events in our stories as opportunities for our growth and for moving forward, then that's what they become, rather than, the ball and chain we wear or the success that our ego, rides the wave on. Yeah. So that's just been a really cool aha moment for me, because when I talk about my story, and I'll get into it momentarily, there's a lot of trauma in so many of our stories. And it's easy to get wrapped up into identifying as that victim and saying, oh, everyone needs to be empathetic for me. And really, that's not what it's about. It's really about learning from the hardships and the failures and recognizing that that's exactly what life is made up of ups and downs and successes and failures. So as I say that, I'm going to launch into my trauma.
But that's what you, right. But I really do appreciate that caveat, because, right, a lot of times we think that trauma has to define us for the rest of our lives.
Exactly.
And so what's really nice is to see, and when we talk to your story, right, is to be able to see that a journey to evolutionary leadership, right, involves recognizing and self-reflection on trauma you've had and learnings. And now taking those learnings, now that you're able to share those, is helping shape other people from those learnings, which is a beautiful story that I know we'll get further into, of just what you've been able to do and the Monarch method. But I'll let you get into your story. Sorry, we've been dying to hear your story.
That's okay.
Now I'm preventing it from happening. Apologies.
So for me, I had probably 3 or 4 pivotal moments in my life. And the first one that I recall most clearly was when I was 15 years old. I grew up in a household where there was, a fair amount of disruption, physical, emotional struggle, abuse, whatever you want to call it. And so at 15, I was certainly struggling with who I was and who was I becoming. I had depression and very low self-esteem and those kinds of things. But, making it through, I was in school. And on this particular day that I recall, my grandparents were coming to visit, and I adore my grandparents. I couldn't wait to get home from school. Oh, yeah. And got there, and there was the flurry of hugs and kisses at the door, and I love yous and I missed yous and all that good stuff. And my grandmother was notorious for bringing us either big checks or big gifts. Oh, so
that was she's right.
Right. Well, I guess for me back then, we're talking, 40 some odd years ago, a big check was $100, right?
Well, still though, right?
Right. So she said, come into your bedroom with me, let's chat. And I was like, let's go. So we get in there and she says, sit on the bed. And she looks at me and she says, now, I want to pay you $100. There's $100, right? I want to pay you $100 to change your personality because no one likes you and you're not very lovable. And at the time, for a kid already, for a teen, forget whether or not you're struggling, but for a teen, plus a teen who struggled with self-value to begin with, I just thought, you know, my world had come to an end. And as she droned on about how and why I needed to make changes, I really wasn't hearing her. I just felt my heart beating and I wanted the floor to open up. I wanted to die in that moment because my grandmother, of all people in the world, now was telling me what I felt like I knew in my heart was that I wasn't enough. And I was just hearing it from one of the most beloved people in my life. So fast forward 3 years and I was a freshman in college and still struggling a great deal with depression and a lot of thoughts about suicide. And then in January of my freshman year, I attempted suicide. Clearly it didn't work, thankfully. And in hindsight, I didn't want to die. I wanted the heartache to go away. And I didn't know how to make that happen. And back then, there was so much less support than there is even now for mental and emotional struggles. And you know, you were crazy if you had these kinds of thoughts back then, much more so than now. And even now, there's way too much stigma on what are just normal struggles and normal challenges. So there was that. And then fast forward another few years and I was very successful in my career. I started out in psychology, where I am now, but working with children in particular. And I worked with adolescent males in the juvenile justice system. And I worked with the hardcore of the hardcore. I was a warden in a juvenile prison, and I was good at it. I was really good at it because I had disconnected from my emotions. And I wouldn't allow myself to feel, because if I felt, I'd feel the heartache. When you shut off one emotion, you're effectively shutting them all off. So, you know, I was a good marching little soldier. You know, I had very little emotion with regard to what was going on around me and within me, which made me great in that type of situation with some really tough kids and some really tough situations. By the time I reached my mid-30s, I realized that even though my professional life was continuing to be successful, my personal life was a disaster. Relationships, friendships, even relationships with bosses. I was just so angry. And that was, anger was easier to project than this lack of self-worth. And at the core of it was this fear that I just wasn't enough. And so at 35, I had seen a number of counselors, none of whom had really done much for me as far as taking me forward. They were in the conventional counseling system. And this particular woman had a background in spirituality. And for the first time in my life, she taught me about the concepts such as intuition and inner power and intention and wisdom and our ability to evolve and transform. And that was probably the most pivotal point in my life, which really began my road towards developing the theories and methods that I have in place now, becoming an author and being so successful as what I do with regard to transformation and leadership development.
Well, I'm glad though that you were able to be honest with yourself, right? And find this, right, and connect, right? Because it required you to connect as well to the message that you were being given. And I think that what's really hard right now, especially for business leaders, right, is it's a time which could be a lot of fear of being vulnerable, especially when you have now you're an executive and you're the COVID-19 and you've had employees that have lost loved ones or employees that are just simply stressed, or you've had to let employees go,
Right.
or you're dealing with, you know, or you're trying to also look at your executive team and recognize that the important voice of Black lives are missing from that.
Yeah.
And so with all of this, right, there's a lot of fears, but would love to know from you, from your perspective, of what is the bravery that during this time that business leaders do need to face, right? What are those fears, at least you think, that are in front of them during this time that they need to address?
So I would say the biggest one is, who am I beneath my exterior, beneath my success, beneath my titles and my roles and how I show up in the world? Who am I at my core? And where is my life out of balance? Because anywhere that we are out of balance personally is going to be very much a part of who we are professionally. We can't separate the two. You cannot be a leader and be great at all aspects of it while feeling like I'm horrible at other aspects in my personal life, either self-care or relationships. There has to be balance in those things. And particularly for men, even though I think that probably sounds a little bit sexist, but our culture raises men and women in very different ways. And typically men are taught that being aggressive and being mind-oriented, thinking, succeeding, planning, running, leading is what makes you the man you are. And then for women, and I know now there's a lot of, you know, gray area around men and women, but as far as traditional roles, women are raised to believe that being emotional and being intuitive and being nurturing and being passive in a way is what is success for them. And really, all of those things need to show up in one person, because we're all of that. We have masculine and feminine traits and characteristics inside us, and it's important that we balance all of those in how we show up.
Agreed. So for those leaders, business leaders, right? And I know we've talked about this before, but facing those fears can be paralyzing. And there are lows, but there are highs as well in regards to that transformation, or at least leading into that transformation. From your experience, would you mind sharing, at least from what you've seen, of business leaders, right, that have that fear of facing that? They face it, but they experience, whoa, I'd never expected to feel this way.
Right.
Would love from your perspective, yeah.
So you mean what are the lows versus the highs?
Yes, yeah. Exactly.
So I think the lows come from a lifetime of wondering if you're enough, not to mention feeling like I'm for sure not enough and I have to prove to the world that I am, because if I prove it to the world, then maybe I'll feel it. So I think that's a part of the low. But in addition to that, because of how our conventional mental and emotional health care systems have been designed, there really isn't a clear pathway to getting past those beliefs about who we are at our core and transforming and moving forward. And the current system just doesn't work for that. It works for many things, but not necessarily for growing, evolving, transforming, and moving forward. There needs to be a new focus away from our conventional models of science and health to do that. So I think that's the low, combined with how we are already, so many of us, feeling like we're not enough. And then there's a system out there that just doesn't get us to where we want to be. On the other side of that, the high is that you already have all of that wisdom and power and belief and love inside of you. It's not something you have to go out and find. It exists within you. So it's really just about peeling back the layers and revealing that piece. And now with new science and new methods, such as my own, and the science that backs that up, that has been around for decades now, the pathway towards that transformation and to stepping into who you are, and honoring and loving who you are so you can do that for everybody else that you lead, is really straightforward, and it's actually fun. In my Monarch method that I've worked with so many people, there hasn't been one person that has said, oh my gosh, this has been like raw and painful and drudgery. Yeah. They're like, this is like unbelievably simple and straightforward and fast. So there are ways to get to that place that are exciting.
That's what's great. And you know what? I'd love to actually go into the Monarch method and go through that, and also go through the science. But of course, start out at the Monarch method. And would you mind explaining the Monarch method? And because I think I know that we talked about it, it was revolutionary for me just to hear, because I have been given, when I became an executive, I've been given these blinders, right? And they said, business and humanity have to be separate.
Yeah.
And I always struggled with that, but I did find leaders that were able to blend both and mimic those. But it's very hard to come by to find that, and to have a process in order to action that. So would you mind telling us a little bit more about the Monarch method?
Sure. So the Monarch method is a 3-step formula for identifying what's blocking you and getting it out of the way so that you can move forward in your life and achieve your goals and success. That's sort of the straightforward strategy to it. The interesting piece is really the science beneath that, which I call the catalyst factor. So, brief history lesson. Our health systems, our human development systems, which includes leadership, growth, education, healthcare, all of it, medicine, have been grounded in, since the 1800s, in Darwin's theory of genetic determinism. That our DNA, our genes, determine who we are, psychologically, our personalities, as well as physically, our bodies, and all the characteristics that make up those things. And that there's very little we can do to change that. And so that science basically said that we are primarily beings of cognition and matter. So physical body and brain, and that was pretty much it.
Yeah.
Well, fortunately, decades ago, there are a number of researchers and scientists who decided this just doesn't make sense. There are so many things happening with us physically and psychologically that are defying the laws of this old science. And so new sciences began to emerge. One of them in particular, which I'm most fond of as far as my theories and my method, is epigenetics.
And me too.
And basically epigenetics says that we are not primarily beings of cognition and matter. In fact, we are beings of energy and belief. And that our beliefs, our perceptions of the world around us, how we process and internalize those, actually influences our cellular growth and changes and transforms our genes and DNA.
Wow.
And that's huge. I mean, that just turns science and potential right on its head for physically and psychologically.
Right? Because how often do you, right? Because really by theory is you should have stayed exactly the person your grandmother said you would be.
Yeah.
Completely transform, you're a horrible person.
Right.
And you're kind of stuck of being that horrible person.
Right.
And there are other things associated, right, than just that example, of course. But that's what I do think is so interesting about science you've been able, that you've leveraged to support the Monarch method.
Yeah.
And so for the Monarch method, right, and I know a lot of leaders, business leaders, I think now, especially all of us, because all of us are looking to business and seeing where leaders are going to take us next. And that's a huge responsibility
Yeah.
during this time now. And I know that you had talked about the method, and it's a relatively straightforward process. How long would this process take from start to finish for the Monarch method?
Just a matter of months. And the way it works in brief is that these beliefs that make up who we are and actually are the facilitators of our entire transformation and evolution throughout our lives. These beliefs actually contribute to all of our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. So there isn't any one single behavior, feeling, or thought that does not originate from a core belief of some sort. And for most of us, our primary core beliefs are established in the first 10 years of our lives. And I call that our operating system.
Okay.
So for someone who grows up in an environment that is volatile and, emotionally abusive, physically abusive, they learn that being quiet and being invisible and staying in the background is safer than stepping up and subjecting yourself to this. So that belief becomes subconscious. And that is a tape that runs and runs and runs really your whole life until you choose to identify it and change it. And for a leader in particular, being quiet, being invisible, and staying in the background is not helpful, really. And it works against you. So even though that belief served you at one point, as all of our beliefs do, they serve us very well. They're not intended to stay with us our entire lives. Our core beliefs transform with us, are intended to transform with us throughout our lives to support our current goals moving forward and our current circumstances. So it's really important for leaders in particular to recognize what beliefs that are subconscious are working against me. And in fact, 90% of who we are is subconscious and only 10% conscious. So when we have a conscious goal of I'm going to show up this way and I'm going to feel and think and act this way, and it just isn't sustainable. We just can't get ourselves to stay there, or in some cases even get to that goal. It's because that 10% of consciousness is running up to 90% of subconscious outdated beliefs. Those are the tapes that are running that have to be updated.
And there's a lot, and I know we had talked about this, and during this time now, right, there's a lot of old beliefs that have to be shed and replaced with new beliefs. And it's so interesting when you say that, of that 10%, right? Because I think for most of us, obviously, we think it's the reverse.
Yeah.
Right.
Right. I did.
We're wondering why this isn't happening. Come on, what is not happening? And
right.
90% of subconscious, right, that is actually driving us rather than the 10%
right.
that we're conscious of. And I've talked to someone else too about emotional intelligence, which links definitely right to this, but it's this idea of getting curious with yourself.
Mm-hmm. And
it's hard to do that as a business leader because people are watching as you're being curious with yourself.
Right. Right.
But I think that, and there are ways, of course, to do that, to handle that. And
sure.
I know that's not the conversation we're having right now, because that's really dependent on the leaders and their employees that they have. But it really is this idea of now being there, people will stumble. But it's about learning. There's a benefit for the stumble of, you have to replace these old beliefs now with new belief sets that really will move us forward. Yeah. And that's a continual process. I wish I could say that it'd be over, but like you said, we have to evolve.
We do.
It's about continuously evolving. But how do we find out more information about the Monarch method? I would love to know.
Well, one of the things that I was thinking of as you were just talking is that one of the surprising things you asked earlier, what are the highs and lows for leaders in this process of transformation? And one of the surprising things for most leaders that they discover is that the expectations they have for themselves as far as how to be an effective leader, which include not necessarily being vulnerable or emotional or compassionate, are not the expectations that most people have. Most people would prefer that leaders show up and look like them.
Yeah.
Yes, they want them to lead, but they also want them to be human, and to have weaknesses and strengths. So that's always a pleasant discovery for people, is that, gosh, I was so hard on myself and I thought that this is what the world wanted. And really it was just my own sort of demons that were saying, you have to do it this way or it won't work. So.
No, and I think that's important, because I think, right, what a lot of people forget is this is a shared global trauma.
Yeah.
Right? Doesn't matter if you're an executive, employee, what race you are, what gender you are. This is a shared global trauma that has impacted all of us. Absolutely. So the reality of, like, you have to be this robot that doesn't have, I shouldn't say robot, but robotic meaning emotion,
right,
is just not valid. And I hope that leaders, in hearing this, can give themselves the grace to accept that they can, right, that you can be you, that people are wanting to see you show up.
Right.
And
I like to say it's
thing too.
And I like to say it's time to wear your grace.
Wow. Yes.
Yeah.
I love that a lot. It is time to wear your grace.
Yeah.
It really is. It's time to wear your grace. I love that. Yeah. I'm going to keep saying that over and over.
You can say that as often as you like.
Thank you. Thank you. But so what I would love to do, though, is provide people a way to get in contact with you and find more about the Monarch Method. How do we do that?
So I invite people to visit my website. It's either drkimblegreene.com or a much simpler version is themonarchmethod.com. They get you to the same place. I have 2 free quizzes on my site called the Core Instincts Quiz and then the Leadership Core Instincts Quiz. And it's a really good starting point for people just to figure out, where am I now with regard to 5 categories of how we operate. What do I rely on most and what do I rely on least? So that's a great way to start. And I invite people to reach out and ask questions, and I love to connect with people. So
thank you for offering that quiz as well as developing it. And I told you that I looked through that quiz, and I think it's so beneficial to have a baseline.
Yeah.
Really understand yourself, and a baseline where you can do this just to be curious.
Right. Right.
And then take the next steps that you need to.
No pressure. And the nice thing about the quiz is it doesn't compare you to some standard that exists. It really is about taking 5 categories: mental, emotional, physical, relational, and spiritual, and figuring out which ones do I rely on most and which ones do I rely on least. And it gives you a baseline for bringing those into balance. So you're not compared to a standard or to anyone else. You're really just figuring out what's going on subconsciously that I'm not necessarily aware of.
I'm very glad you did that, where you didn't compare it to you, right? Because that is the hardest thing. It
is feeling like, oh my God, am I going to fail or be like not enough again?
Yes, not enough again. And you are enough. And that's a beautiful, like I had said earlier, of the story that you'd share with us, and the ability for leaders to really recognize and be themselves is a beautiful narrative. And not only just a beautiful narrative, but a narrative that can help and save people now.
Absolutely.
Because that stress of trying to be someone you're not during this time is a difficult extra added stressor that is really unnecessary for business leaders, just because I hope that they can wear their grace.
Yes.
Right? See, I did it already. I put it in.
Yay.
But no, thank you very much, Dr. Kimble Greene. And it has been lovely talking to you. And I definitely want to connect you with our community. If they have questions and comments, I hope you don't mind. I will make sure
absolutely
put them in contact with you. But thank you once again.
And thank you for what you do, Rico. It's so important. And you're you're doing amazing things for the people that are struggling. So
Oh,
thank
thank
you.
you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. No, that means a lot to me. Thank you. But have a great rest of the day.
You too.
Thanks.
Take care. Bye-bye.